There are two kinds of silence at a dinner table: the comfortable kind, where everyone is too full and too happy to talk, and the other kind, the kind that sits on your chest like a stone, the kind where everyone pretends not to be watching you, but they absolutely are. My family specialized in the second kind. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. At our 30-year gala, my father toasted my sister's success, then turned to me with a pitying smile, praising my quiet, unremarkable life. As a way to remind the investors I hadn't made the cut, I sat there smiling, ready to expose their secret debt. The applause for my father's toast was a sharp, rhythmic sound that filled the grand ballroom of our legacy estate in Austin. Gary stood there, glowing with the kind of pride men usually reserve for their first million. He looked at Brooke and Trevor like they were the high-yield assets in his portfolio, then spared a pitying glance for me, the family's supposed underachiever. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting warm light on the white tablecloths and crystal glasses, but I felt cold inside. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the second kind, the one that sits on your chest like a stone. Everyone was watching me, waiting for me to shrink, to look at my plate, or to find a reason to refill a water glass. But I didn't cry. I didn't ask why he felt the need to cut me down during our firm's 30th anniversary gala. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and today the account was empty. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I leaned forward, my face a mask of serene professional clarity. I'd spent 15 years practicing this expression at this exact table, absorbing humiliations while my father used me as the punchline to his pride. I wasn't just the disappointing middle child anymore. I was an elite financial auditor, and I had just seen a line item in their lives that didn't balance. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. "Trevor," I said, my voice light and genuinely curious, cutting through the heavy air, "could you pass the appetizers? Thank you." He reached for the tray, his movements practiced and casual, the movements of a man who had grown very comfortable being admired by his wife's family for a success he hadn't actually earned. "So," I continued, serving myself a small portion with deliberate, agonizing slowness, "how is that $680,000 refinance you took from your bank coming along?" The fork slipped from his hand. It didn't just fall. It clattered hard against the fine porcelain plate with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the sudden, suffocating stillness. Every single person at that table went completely still. My mother, Michelle, froze with her wineglass halfway to her lips, her eyes widening as the liquid trembled. Brooke's smile, that perfect socialite mask she wore for the cameras, shattered instantly, replaced by a thin wire of panic. And my father, the glow, was gone. He looked at Trevor with the expression of a man who had just realized the ground beneath his expensive chair was actually quicksand. "I'm sorry," I said, tilting my head slightly as I watched Trevor's jaw move without a single sound coming out. "Did I say something wrong?" For years, I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, paying the emotional dividends while they enjoyed the status. But I'd stopped playing along. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. Trevor placed both hands flat on the table, a gesture of a man trying to physically hold himself together. His voice, when it finally came, was a low, controlled hiss that dropped into something careful and dangerous. "That is private financial information," he said. "You had no right to see that." "You're right," I agreed pleasantly, the words tasting like victory. "I didn't go looking for it. Last quarter, I was the lead auditor for the venture capital firm you applied to for a bailout loan. Your private financial distress was part of the due diligence report I had to sign off on. You weren't my brother, then you were just a high-risk liability on my desk." I turned my gaze directly to my father, letting the weight of my knowledge land. Because a paid-off house and a house that was refinanced for $680,000 4 months ago are not exactly the same thing, are they? I didn't wait because I wanted to show Gary. I waited because the certified forensic report was only finalized at 4 p.m. today. I needed the paper trail to be bulletproof before I fired the first shot. The sound my mother made was barely a sound at all. Just a sharp, jagged exhale like a secret leaving her body after being held for too long. I felt like myself for the first time in 15 years. The legacy they'd built was a facade, and the lease was officially up. The air in the ballroom was thick, vibrating with the $680,000 reality I had just forced into existence. I watched them staring at me, their faces caught in the strobe light of the truth I had just dropped. They didn't know I wasn't just an attendee at this gala. I was the auditor of their entire existence. I had spent my 30s building a career they never bothered to understand. I am a top-tier auditor. Numbers do not have egos, and they do not tell stories to make themselves feel better. They just balance. 2 years ago, when Gary's firm was bleeding cash and on the verge of a quiet collapse, I didn't let it fail. I used my own capital, moving funds through 3 separate legal entities with surgical precision to stabilize his payroll. I did it because I believed that was what family meant. I was the silent anchor holding the ship steady while they danced on the deck. Gary never asked where the sudden influx of business came from. He just assumed his legacy was too grand to fail. And then there was Brooke. Every designer bag, every curated trip she posted to her social media followers. It wasn't Trevor's banking bonus. It was me. She knew exactly whose money she was spending when her credit cards hit their limits. She would call me, her voice dripping with a fake sweetness she only used when she needed a wire transfer. I paid for it all. But when we sat at Gary's table, she would smile and tell him how well Trevor was doing at the bank. She used my success to polish Trevor's image because Trevor was the kind of investment that made our father proud, and I was just the girl with the boring job. People might ask why an elite auditor would sit in silence for 15 years while her father used her as a cautionary tale for his business partners. They do not understand the invisible chain of the survivor. My family was a house of mirrors where I was taught that my only value was my utility. I lived in a prison without bars, built out of the learned helplessness that comes from years of being told you are the backup plan. I stayed because I had been conditioned to believe that my worth was transactional. I thought that if I was useful enough, if I bailed them out enough times, they would finally see me as a daughter rather than a resource. But as I looked at Brooke's trembling hands and my father's fading glow, I realized I had been subsidizing my own destruction. I wasn't a family member to them. I was a subscription service they had forgotten to cancel. That was the moment I closed the account on my emotions. No more extensions, no more credit for people who only knew how to take. I wasn't the failure in this story. I was the only person in the room who actually owned what they had. They were living on a legacy that was 40% underwater, and the bill was finally due. I watched my father's face as he sat there, the stem of his wine glass still gripped in his hand. It wasn't the look of a parent concerned about their child's financial ruin. It was the look of a man watching his favorite trophy shatter on a marble floor. Gary didn't care that Trevor was drowning in debt. He cared that I had pointed it out in a room full of people whose opinions he valued more than my own life. This was the status trap, the place where love is sacrificed for the sake of a glossy brochure. Gary has spent 30 years convinced that he was building a dynasty, but what he was actually building was an illusion of power, the kind provided by an empty wallet. He believed that being the chief executive officer of a firm and having a son-in-law with a prestigious bank title gave him an inherent right to command respect. He couldn't distinguish between having and being. He had the estate, he had the Gala, and he had the perfect children to show off to his peers. But his position was just a shell, rented with borrowed credibility. Once that credit vanished, he had no internal value to stand on. He was realizing in real time that his social standing was just a line item he could no longer afford. I saw the realization hit him like a cold front moving across the Texas hill country. The daughter he had praised was a hollow vessel, and the daughter he had dismissed was the only one with a solid foundation. He loved the status that Brooke and Trevor provided the way they looked on a holiday card, and the way they validated his own narrow definition of success. He didn't love them. He loved the reflection of himself he saw in their fabricated lives. "Is it true, Trevor?" my father finally asked, his voice coming out as a thin, brittle rasp. He didn't look at Brooke. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the man he had just toasted as a fiscal master. Trevor didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth is, a binary system, it either balances or it doesn't. And as an auditor, I was simply there to report the variance. My father's entire ego was based on a lie that cost $680,000. He had spent years treating me like a cautionary tale because my success didn't fit into his narrow portfolio. Now, he was realizing that the only thing more dangerous than a daughter who doesn't fit the mold is a son-in-law who uses that mold to hide a six-figure catastrophe. The chandeliers continued to sparkle, but the light was different now. It didn't feel like a celebration of a 30-year legacy. It felt like a floodlight in an interrogation room. My father wasn't sitting at the head of a dynasty anymore. He was sitting at the head of a wreckage, and for the first time, he realized that I was the only person in the room who knew how to read the damage report. As the word IRS echoed through the ballroom, the room didn't just go silent, it began to empty. The investors, the very men Gary had spent 30 years impressing, were putting down their glasses and heading for the exits without a single word of goodbye. The gala didn't end with an apology. It ended with the sound of retreating footsteps and a silence so jagged it could cut glass. As the guests began to disperse, whispering behind their silk programs, Gary, Brooke, and Trevor cornered me in the estate's private garden. The night air was cool, smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine, but the atmosphere between us was toxic. "You're a monster, Destiny," Brooke hissed, her socialite mask finally discarded. Her eyes were red, but not from grief, from pure, unadulterated fury. "You waited for this. You sat on that information just to destroy me on our father's biggest night." I leaned against a stone pillar, feeling the cold texture of the rock against my spine. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I just pulled back my sleeve and checked my watch. 9:42 p.m. "I didn't destroy you, Brooke," I said, my voice clinical and detached. "I simply reported the variance. If your life was a solvent entity, a few words wouldn't have caused a total liquidation." Gary stepped forward, his face a dark shade of crimson. He looked like he was vibrating with the need to exert the power he no longer truly possessed. "You think you're so smart? You've embarrassed this family in front of our biggest investors. Consider yourself cut off. Every trust, every cent of your inheritance, it's gone. You're no longer a part of this legacy." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a father. I saw a CEO whose flagship product had just been recalled for safety violations. "The legacy you're threatening to take away is currently 40% underwater, Dad," I replied calmly. "You're offering me a share in a sinking ship, as if it's a life jacket?" Trevor, who had been uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke. His voice was low and threatening the tone of a cornered predator. "I have friends in the banking industry, Destiny. I can make sure your career as an auditor is over before Monday morning. One call about unethical access to private records, and you're blacklisted." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with the same clarity I use when I find a hidden offshore account. "Go ahead, Trevor," I said. "Make that call. But before you do, you should know that I wasn't just looking at the refinance paperwork. I was looking at the collateral." I saw him stiffen. The threat he was trying to build collapsed instantly. He knew. "You've been using the family name as a credit line for years," I continued, my voice gaining a lethal precision. "And Gary has been so blinded by your status that he never checked the receipts. But I've checked them, every single one." Gary turned to Trevor, his eyes darting back and forth. The ground was shifting again. "What is she talking about, Trevor? What collateral?" Trevor didn't answer. He looked at Brooke, who looked at the ground. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. I pushed off the pillar and began walking toward the driveway, leaving them in the shadows of the garden they thought they owned. Inside, my mind was already moving to the next spreadsheet. This wasn't a family drama anymore. This was a criminal investigation. The following morning, the silence at the estate was different. It wasn't the heavy stone of the dinner table, but the brittle, terrifying quiet of a crime scene. I sat in the library with my mother, Michelle. I didn't bring tea or comfort. I brought a digital folder of scanned records. My mother has always been the silent watcher of our family, caught between the hope that her family would change and the harsh truth of the destruction occurring around her. She spent decades choosing the illusion of harmony over the reality of conflict, but today she had reached her deadline. "Look at this signature, Mom," I said, my voice as neutral as a tax return. "This is the document for the $680,000 refinance Trevor took out." I slid the tablet across the mahogany table. It was a digital copy of her private inheritance deed, the money her own parents had left specifically for her security. Trevor hadn't just refinanced his and Brooke's home, he had used my mother's legacy as collateral. "I never signed that," Michelle whispered, her hand trembling as she touched the screen. I remember Trevor asking me to look over some bank forms as a professional courtesy, but I never authorized a lien on my property. As the designated trustee of your estate, Trevor didn't just bypass requirements, he exploited his fiduciary power to forge your signature and verify his own paperwork. He used a mobile notary with a revoked license, someone he'd used for gray bank deals before. He thought a backdated stamp and a forged signature from a woman who trusted him would never be scrutinized. He didn't just lie to Gary, he stole from you to fund Brooke's socialite fantasies. This was the criminal twist I had been digging for. Trevor wasn't just a failure or a debtor. He was a predator who had been feeding on the family's foundation. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore, it was a felony. I watched my mother's face collapse. This was the moment of her silent regret. Her actions weren't a sudden outburst, but the result of decades of internal struggle. She had seen the signs for years, Trevor's shifting stories, Brooke's sudden bursts of spending, the way they both avoided my eyes whenever the word accountability came up. She had watched it all, but her desire to protect the golden child had blinded her to the fact that her protector had become a thief. She realized now that her hope had been misplaced and that the truth was unavoidable. "I wanted so badly for them to be who your father said they were," she said, her voice finally breaking. "I thought if I was quiet enough, they would find their way. But my silence just gave them a place to hide their crimes." Before Trevor could utter another lie, Michelle stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm revoking your power of attorney effective immediately, Trevor. And Gary. Don't bother coming back to the Westlake house. I've already called my lawyer to freeze our joint accounts." "Quiet isn't strong, Mom," I said, repeating the lesson I had learned at 30 years old. Sometimes, quiet is just complicity. I checked my watch. The audit was nearing completion. The truth was no longer a secret held in my chest. It was a weapon of justice ready to be fired. My father had wanted a 30th anniversary legacy, and I was about to give him the only one he had left, the one built on the forged signature of his own wife. The knock on my door was frantic, lacking the rhythmic authority of the man I had known my entire life. When I opened it, I didn't see the executive who held court in grand ballrooms. I saw Gary, a man who looked like his entire stock portfolio had just been delisted. He was diminished, his suit was wrinkled, and the arrogance that usually puffed out his chest had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell. "Destiny, please," he said, his voice cracked and desperate. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into my small, quiet apartment, his eyes darting around at my minimalist furniture, as if looking for a reason to judge me. But he couldn't find one. Everything here was owned outright. There were no liens, no forgeries, and no $680,000 secrets hiding in my walls. "You have to stop the audit," he pleaded, reaching out as if to grab my hand, but I stepped back, keeping the kitchen island between us. "The bank is asking questions. The board is hearing rumors. If this gets out, the family legacy is dead. 30 years of work, Destiny? Gone." I looked at him with the same clinical detachment I reserve for a bankruptcy filing. "The legacy isn't dead, Dad. It was murdered months ago. You just hadn't noticed the body yet." I pulled a thick manila envelope from the counter and slid it across the granite. "This is the final audit. Trevor didn't just refinance. He used Mom's private inheritance as collateral with a forged signature. Brooke wasn't just a passive witness. She used her nonprofit foundation to launder the proceeds of that loan. She didn't just know, she orchestrated the fund transfers to maintain her social standing under the guise of charity. They didn't just borrow money. They stole your wife's security to pay for their rented status." Gary's hands shook as he looked at the evidence. The color drained from his face until he was the same shade of gray as his expensive hair. "We can fix this. We can pay it back quietly. Just Give me the file. Don't report it. I'm an auditor, not a co-conspirator. I filed a Form 211 with the IRS whistleblower office an hour ago. They don't care about family loyalty. They only care about the tax liability you've been hiding. You spent 15 years using me as a cautionary tale to make them look better. You praised their fiscal discipline while I was the one keeping your firm from a quiet collapse through third-party entities. You wanted a legacy built on appearances? This is what it looks like when the facade finally falls off. I walked to the door and held it open. The power flip was complete. The man who had once disowned me for failing his expectations was now a beggar in my living room. The legacy you're so desperate to save was built on the betrayal of the only person who actually stayed loyal to you. The lease on your pride is officially up, Gary. It's time to move out. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. I watched him walk into the hallway, a man finally realizing that his entire empire was just a line item I had already deleted. I closed the door and felt something I hadn't felt in my entire adult life. The silence of a house that was entirely, legally, and truthfully mine. The audit is finally complete, and for the first time in my life, the ledger of my soul actually balances. The fallout from that night at the estate was swift and absolute. Trevor was eventually convicted of felony financial fraud and third-degree forgery, receiving a sentence of 5 years. Brooke's curated socialite world evaporated overnight as the banks moved in to liquidate the assets of a life she never truly owned. My father, Gary, retired in a quiet, hollowed-out shame, realizing too late that he had spent 30 years worshiping a golden calf that was actually a Trojan horse. I've come to realize that there is an unpopular truth most of us are too afraid to say out loud: blood is not a valid excuse for abuse. We are told from birth that family is everything, but the truth is that family is a contract of mutual respect and integrity. If the other party stops holding up their end, you have every right to stop funding the deal with your own happiness. I spent 15 years as the silent investor in their dysfunction, but the moment I stopped seeking their approval was the moment I truly became wealthy. If you find yourself in a similar situation, standing on the edge of a family that only sees you as a resource or a punchline, remember that your worth is not a line item in someone else's portfolio. You do not need to stay in a house where you have to make yourself small just to fit through the door. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the expectation that they will ever finally see you. I am finally at peace in my quiet apartment, looking out at a future that I built with facts, numbers, and an unshakable belief in my own value. I stopped being a cautionary tale and started being the author of my own story. If you've ever had to choose yourself over a family that didn't choose you, please share this video. Your story might be the courage someone else needs to finally speak up. Don't forget to follow for more stories of justice served cold.